Hola a todos, muy buenos días. Mi nombre es Nicolás O'Connor, soy el Publisher y CRO acá en Americonomía. Y bienvenidos al tercer día de Multilatinas y la reactivación. Hemos tenido 2 días llenos de contenidos, hemos hablado con más de 15 empresas de toda la región y hemos aprendido mucho sobre cómo las empresas multilatinas piensan reactivarse el próximo año. Ahora vamos a hablar con 2 reconocidos expertos de Scotiabank y vamos a hablar un poco de las perspectivas económicas que tenemos para el próximo año. Les advierto que esto va a ser una conversación en inglés, pero como siempre les recuerdo que pueden enviar sus preguntas para los panelistas en español y yo los puedo traducir para nuestros expertos acá. Así que ahora voy a pasar al inglés. Good morning. We've got 2 really great experts here with us from Scotiabank today, Robert Williams and Brett House. Robert, you're Senior Vice President of International and Corporate Banking at Scotiabank. I'd like to get started with you. First of all, maybe tell us a bit more about yourself, your role with Scotiabank. And I think a good way to get this conversation started today will be to tell us a bit more about the bank's strategy throughout Latin America. I mean, it's really great to have Scotiabank partnering with us at these events because you're present in all these markets where a lot of these companies are operating. So I'm sure you've got some valuable insight that you can share with our audience here today.
Muchas gracias, Nicolás, y bienvenidos a todos y gracias a nuestros invitados por unirse a nuestra discusión sobre Latinoamérica 2021 y el más allá. As you mentioned, Nicolás, I'm Robert Williams, and I'm currently the Senior Vice President of Corporate and Commercial Banking at Scotiabank in our international division. Ultimately, I am accountable for providing strategic direction to our wholesale banking heads across our footprint, ensuring that business plans, initiatives are executed in compliance with the bank's risk appetite, regulations, and internal policies in the different jurisdictions where we operate. I've been with the bank for about 20 years. Most of it spent in Latin America. And prior to my current role, I've had the privilege of serving our clients in such areas as credit risk management, corporate banking, wealth management, and more recently as country head and CEO of our franchise in both Panama and the Dominican Republic. In regards to your question, I would say that Scotiabank's strategy is to position itself as the Bank of the Americas. And in line with this strategy, over the past 7 years, it has been rationalizing its footprint by de-risking non-core jurisdictions and doubling down in the countries where we believe there is long-term upside potential, and the Pacific Alliance countries are a cornerstone to Scotiabank's international strategy. As most of you may know, the Pacific Alliance was formed back in April of 2011 by Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru, all of which are investment-grade countries. And its main objective as an alliance is aimed at facilitating liberalization of the exchange of goods and services, the free movement of people, of capital, and fostering mechanisms of cooperation among the member countries. In addition to integration, the countries also develop common objectives and share best practices in a number of areas, such as tourism, intellectual property, regulatory frameworks, innovation, mining, climate change, just to name a few. The 4 countries are have a combined population of about 220 million inhabitants and contribute to about 35% of the region's GDP, just roughly over $2 trillion, which translates into a GDP per capita of about $10,000, which is in line with the GDP per capita of the upper middle income bracket worldwide. It also represents about 50% of the regional trade and about 45% of the foreign direct investment that goes into the entire Latam region. So pre-COVID debt to GDP across the PAC ranged between 27.5 in Peru and 48.4 in Colombia. And all countries, and I guess Mexico to a bit of a lesser extent, provided important assistance programs to their populations and business community during the height of the pandemic. And I think this is an important point because obviously, we're in the middle of the pandemic still. The population is mainly young and constitutes a qualified workforce, as well as an attractive subset of consumers whose purchasing power is in constant growth. important to note is that Scotiabank has more than 90,000 employees worldwide, and approximately 50% of our employees now reside in Latin America, and Spanish is their maternal language. Our unique footprint in Latam allows us to add value by helping our customers navigate, the complexities associated with operating in multiple jurisdictions. We know all too well the market nuances, from legal to regulatory to business norms and to cultural etiquette. Our job is to know the market and to share that knowledge with our clients so that their business ventures in the region have a higher probability of success. Ultimately, we strive to deepen our relationship by sharing our expertise, providing connectivity in cross-border operations, and offering the entire continuum of our product suite, starting from traditional transaction banking through balance sheet support, trade, FX, debt capital market, M&A. Latam has, going back very briefly to the whole issue with coronavirus, it has not been spared of the novel coronavirus, and countries like Peru have been hit particularly hard, as we all know. Having said this, I will say that I think we've been positively surprised about how the Pacific Alliance countries have gone about addressing the pandemic. What we found is that companies in our portfolio remained quite resilient, and I believe that this is due in great part to some of the measures that were taken by the government authorities across the PAC. All countries, to some degree, put in place fiscal, legal, and regulatory measures akin to those that we've seen in developed countries as well, that allowed both the business community and the population in general to withstand the lockdowns. In Chile, for example, the government reacted quickly and announced a fiscal stimulus package worth about $12 billion US, about 4.7% of GDP, to tackle the economic impact of COVID-19. The stimulus package, considered to be the largest in the country's history, consisted of boosting the budget of the healthcare system, implementing measures to protect workers against the loss of income, and providing support to small and medium-sized enterprises through tax measures. The Central Bank of Chile also reduced their interest rate to 0.5%, which is where it has remained, and announced an increase in its bond purchasing program to about $4 billion US. Also, the central bank, in coordination with the financial industry, announced measures loosening regulatory credit requirements and increasing the flow of credit to companies and consumers. Similar measures were also taken in Peru, where the government also implemented the Reactiva program, aimed at maintaining the business sector operational. The program provided liquidity by way of government guarantee loans to the financial system to companies that had been adversely affected by the lockdowns. Both Peru and Chile also took the extraordinary measures of allowing employees to withdraw from their retirement accounts, up to 25% in the case of Peru and 10% in the case of Chile, allowing for an additional liquidity of about $12 billion and $20 billion respectively, in local currency equivalents, of course. And in addition to that, on November 10th, Chilean lawmakers authorized a second tranche of this withdrawal, also equivalent to 10%, where Peru, and Peru also followed with their 10% on November 12th. Obviously, the long-term impact of these unprecedented decisions are still unclear, but at this point in time, it at least seems that these actions that have been taken by the government will help to quell the impact of the coronavirus on the population. In Colombia, the central bank acted promptly by cutting rates and providing liquidity to the market. It implemented a bond purchasing program for the first time, allowing for financial stress to ease. Furthermore, the government provided support to low-income families by way of existing cash transfer programs, and also introduced a new program called Ingreso Solidario to provide unconditional cash transfers to about 2.9 million poor and vulnerable households. The government also implemented a program called Programa de Apoyo al Empleo Formal in order to preserve formal employment by paying about 40% of the minimum wage to all employees in firms with at least a 20% loss in revenue. In summary, the Colombian government was quick to unveil programs to counter the effects of COVID, that included additional cash transfers, as mentioned, value-added tax rebates, tax deferrals, and financial supports for small and medium-sized companies. Now, Mexico seems to be an outlier here with the government that has been focused more on austerity since it took office. However, they did implement certain measures, including reducing the central bank benchmark rate to about 425 basis points, 4.25%, and announcing a package of measures for credit restructuring to encourage banks to restructure loans for clients that requested it. Obviously, we see all of these measures as a show of strength on the part of the PAC countries when compared to their peers in the region. However, there are, of course, areas of concern. In particular, we are keeping a close eye on certain industries and subsectors, such as hospitality, discretionary retail, automotive sector, oil and gas, aviation, and even infrastructure like airports, due to the more direct hit that that COVID has had on them. But all of these government measures will undoubtedly create challenges, right? Because the quantitative easing, which is a byproduct of the government stimulus, will generate excess liquidity in a time when companies have reduced their capex requirements to adjust for COVID. This will in turn create margin compressions in a time when the risk is inherently higher. We're also keeping a close eye on the political uncertainty driven by constitutional reform in Chile, the recent events with the impeachment of President Vizcarra in Peru, the appointment of President Sagasti, and the upcoming presidential election in April, and also the upcoming midterm legislature elections in Mexico scheduled for July. But in general, we remain very confident that Latin America and the PAC countries, which are used to volatility in general, will recover and likely come out stronger on the other side of COVID. As Scotiabank, given our longtime presence in Latin America, we know how to navigate this volatility, and we remain committed to supporting our customers in the region through the COVID storm and beyond. So that sort of summarizes our strategy and why we believe that Latin America is the place to be, and why we define ourselves as the Bank of the Americas. But I'll stop there, and now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. You introduced him earlier on, Nicholas. His name is Brett House. He is Vice President and Deputy Chief Economist at Scotiabank. Prior to joining Scotiabank in 2016, Brett was Chief Economist at Align Investment Management in Toronto, and Global Strategist at Woodbine Capital Advisors, a New York-based global macro fund. Brett served as Principal Advisor in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General, and as an economist at the International Monetary Fund. Brett is a Rhodes Scholar with degrees in economics from the University of Oxford and Queen's University at Kingston. Good morning, Brett. Please take it away.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today at what is a pivotal moment for Latin America and the world, as globally the pandemic moves into a new phase and the prospects of vaccines sit on the horizon. Clearly, Latin America, as you mentioned, Robert, hasn't been immune to the pandemic. It has experienced it with a degree in ferocity that puts it as one of the regions that has been a particular hot zone for contagion and public health emergency across the world. That said, what has been really remarkable about the last few months this year in Latin America has been the exceptional policy response by the region's governments and by the region's major businesses. And I think, as we look to the end of the year into the future, those are the things that I think are most salient about this very odd year 2020 for business leaders, policymakers, and investors when thinking about Latin America, both from a relative sense against other emerging markets and indeed in comparison with developed or industrialized advanced markets around the world. Latin America can really hold its head high by looking at the response it's made to the crisis and the beginning of building a reopening process and a reactivation of its economies as we go into the end of the year and 2021. What I think was really remarkable is that policymakers responded, as I mentioned, both quickly, broadly, and in great depth to the arrival of the pandemic on Latin America's shores. As Robert highlighted, the response in places like Peru and Chile was immediate, with substantial lockdowns, substantial public health measures, controls on travel, and policy responses to bridge households and businesses through the efforts to control the contagion. And as a result, I think the region has preserved many of the most critical aspects of its productive infrastructure, so that as reopening takes place, we have the productive businesses and individuals in place to carry forward that reopening and put growth in Latin America back on a trajectory similar to what we saw before the outbreak of the pandemic. Obviously, Q2 in Latin America, the second quarter of this year, saw slowdowns in economic activity that are historical records for the region, as has been the case in the rest of the world. And this is one of the truly different aspects of this crisis compared with, say, the 2008 financial crisis or some of the individual emerging market crises we saw in East Asia in the late 90s, and some of the crises in Latin America that resulted in IMF programs in the early 2000s. This time around, we have a synchronized crisis around the world where almost every country is being affected by the pandemic in similar ways. And as a result of that, policy space to support domestic demand and activity has been far greater for emerging markets than we saw at the beginning of the 2008 crisis, and certainly in response to the dot-com bust and other EM crises at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s. Big lessons have been learned from those past crises, too, that have been applied quickly and effectively by policymakers. As Robert mentioned, we've seen across the emerging markets complex policy rates pulled down to historic lows by central banks in order to ensure that capital is available on a relatively inexpensive basis. We've also seen fiscal measures put into place in a degree and at a scale that is truly unprecedented, with countries like Peru and Chile leading with total packages, when you fold in the release of pension funds, on the order of 17% of GDP in Peru, 12 to 13% of GDP in Chile. These stand head and shoulders with the kind of responses that we've seen in most advanced economies. What's also been distinct this time around is that emerging markets in the main have been content to let their exchange rates absorb the shocks that they've experienced, which is exactly what a floating exchange rate in an inflation targeting regime, as all of the 4 Pacific Alliance countries have, is meant to do. And so rather than spending reserves and impairing the balance of payments in a way that we saw in the early 2000s, as several countries tried to defend exchange rate pegs that were essentially indefensible, instead, this time around, exchange rates have adjusted substantially with, in some cases, 25% depreciations earlier this year. But governments and central banks have responded with very concerted efforts to support demand, growth, and activity in these in the major economies of Latin America. And that really is a transformation from past situations where large dollar-denominated debt stocks prevented policymakers from implementing that combination of policies that allowed exchange rates to adjust, which also boosts the competitiveness of exports, and accompanied them with cheap capital and substantial fiscal spending. And so really, in many ways, what we're seeing is the first crisis where emerging markets with strong policy frameworks and institutions, such as the Pacific Alliance countries, are able to respond in the ways in which developed or advanced economies have traditionally reacted to shocks outside of their control in order to preserve their productive infrastructure, stimulate investment and growth, keep people employed, and cushion the shock on household finances. So in many ways, this is the first global crisis where emerging markets have had the space to react in the ways that developed markets traditionally do. And so this is a distinct crisis from those other financial episodes. In many ways, I'd compare it to the shock and the response that we saw to 9/11, where policymakers reacted in a similar way quickly and amply to ensure that productive potential wasn't knocked out of action. And we saw that as a result, the economic rebound afterward was relatively quick. We've seen that same kind of quickness in some of the reopening and rebound that we've observed in developed and emerging markets, and Latin America is no exception on this front. Despite those incredibly steep drops in economic activity that we saw in Q2, Q3 is seeing concomitantly and proportionately large rebounds in economic activity, which means that looking at GDP proxies for September, economic activity now is only down about 5 to 7% in the Pacific Alliance countries compared with last year. And in Brazil is less than a percentage point off where it was in the same month last year. So while there is still substantial road to cover in the recovery from the crisis, and the prospect of second waves certainly puts the pace of that recovery in some doubt, we've already seen a massive rebuilding and reopening that gives us a lot of confidence that policymakers can manage a second wave, and that major economic actors are prepared to continue to respond to the crisis in a way that is nimble and effective to ensure that growth is recovered in Latin America's major economies. Looking at the public health crisis specifically, and the second wave that is hitting North America particularly hard right now, and parts of Europe, Latin America has been pretty differentiated in the timing of the crisis from the rest of the world. It hit Latin America a little later than Europe and parts of Asia, but it hit it with great force, as we've already discussed. And through the middle of this year, we saw Latin America stand out as a real hot zone of continuing increases in the incidence of new COVID-19 cases. Since then, really, the global headlines around second waves no longer reflect what's going on in Latin America. We've seen the average incidence of new COVID-19 cases declining in all the major economies of the region, with the exception of Argentina recently. And as a result, the reactivation and reopening that is moving at an accelerated pace in places like Colombia, Chile, and Peru has been able to move forward. And we continue to see the possibility that the final bits of the economy that have been difficult to reopen may be able to do so in the months ahead. As Robert mentioned, though, there are going to continue to be challenges in sectors where physical or social distancing is difficult and at odds with basic business models like hospitality, tourism, culture, the arts, and recreation. And those are going to be the areas where specific support from policymakers and the financial sector is going to be really critical to continue bridging those areas of the region's economies through to the period where vaccines begin to be widely distributed and regular economic activity can resume again. So overall, I would say, there are a lot of reasons for hope that we can extract from the experience this year, a lot of ways in which this truly is unprecedented, not just in terms of the pandemic that we're experiencing for the first time at a scale that is on par really only with the 1918 Spanish flu, but also in terms of the way in which policymakers and major business leaders have been able to respond to this crisis in Latin America and mitigate the impact on the region's economies. And as a result, we are very hopeful that 2021 is going to see much better numbers, both here and abroad, sustained demand for the region's exports, and better numbers for the employment sector and households across the Latin American region. So those are some of the big trends that we're looking at, both here at Scotiabank, and I think that are animating global discussions around international finance and macroeconomics, particularly as they focus on the Pacific Alliance countries, Brazil, Argentina, and the other major economies in the Latin American region.
Thanks very much, Brett. That was a very, very interesting overview of what we've got in the region. I don't know if you'd like to start taking a few questions from the audience. I have a couple of questions for you myself that I also like to ask you. The first one has to do with Chile. I'm based in Santiago, even though Amerigo Ramírez presence throughout the region. And, things have been a bit chaotic on the political front, let's just put it that way, over the past while. And indeed, they did announce a very large fiscal stimulus package, $12 billion, but they haven't spent much of it yet. Now, that could be described as being sort of very prudent as such in how they're controlling that spending, but it has resulted in people withdrawing from their pension funds once, and very probably later today, that second withdrawal will be approved, and it's the government that is now proposing that second withdrawal in the face of a proposal from the opposition. Late last night, they also announced another round of the Ingreso Familiar de Emergencia, the emergency income program. But the great argument is that, that the government is saying that they're biding their time. They're saving some of this money for potentially rebrotes or new outbreaks next year. How do you view that management? Because it's all well and good to say, well, we're allocating a lot of money to deal with this, but if you're not spending it, it can have a bit of an impact. So how do you see that so far?
Well, I think it's an important distinction you make between planning and putting into place allocations and actually being able to execute on them. What we have seen across the region, particularly in Peru and Chile, has been both substantial planning at great scale in order to respond with crushing force to the crisis right at the outset, and broadly speaking, some really strong implementation and execution measures. But you're right to raise a bit of caution about the extent to which some of the measures have actually been implemented and executed, and that is going to remain a focus for us as we look at the region. Will remain, I think, a particular focus for multilatinas and other businesses as they assess where retail demand, where consumption, and where business activity is likely to go over the coming months. One of the complications, of course, too, in every country in Latin America is the high degree of informality and the extent to which that makes it difficult to translate policy into actual disbursements of support to the population, where people may not be in the formal tax or social security system, may not be in formal employment, where support to individual companies, be they large or small, translates into employment for households outside the formal sector, and also leads to challenges in terms of delivery of support in kind. I think one of the lessons from the 2008 financial crisis that policymakers in much of the world have taken to heart is the need to respond to a crisis in, as I mentioned, a crushing way and quickly. And I think what we have found, even though there were record outflows from most emerging market economies, including even the best managed economies in Latin America at the onset of the pandemic and lockdowns in March and April, what we've also seen in recent months is really substantial return flows into emerging market equities and fixed income. We saw earlier this week on the 23rd of November, on Monday, Peru come back to the market with a slightly over $4 billion US sovereign issue that included a tranche with a century maturity on it, a 100-year bond. That is a real mark of the global glut in savings and liquidity that exists, that is seeking yield, that Peru could go back to the market immediately on the heels of a couple weeks of really substantial political turmoil. It shows how much money is available, expansionary policies and stimulus policies and bridging financing in Latin America. And to me, it's a sign that policymakers should remain bold, proactive, and forward-looking in maintaining both the integrity of the households and businesses and their productive capacity, and in rolling forward with new ways to do so. And so I think, rather than looking at some traditional measures of debt sustainability, I think, they should be looking at instead at some ways at that wall of capital as an opportunity to really preserve productive capacity, bridge through this crisis, and look at, pulling back from some of that borrowing and some of that spending only when we are well through the threats that we face from the pandemic. The IMF has also been very clear on this in their fiscal monitor, which they published and carried out a range of consultations on back around the IMF World Bank annual meetings in October, which of course were virtual this year. They said very clearly that both advanced and industrialized countries should not withdraw fiscal stimulus or fiscal support to the economies prematurely. And they sounded a warning that in their forecasts, they do too little rather than too much. And so the focus you put on there on execution and indeed on using the dry powder, using the resources that have been built up for a rainy day, I think is the right one, because the rainy day is very much here.
Super. I want to talk a bit about that influx of money that we've seen sort of returning to emerging markets. It's something we've been looking at here in the magazine and thinking about how we can analyze it, because there has been sort of a jump ever since Joe Biden's victory in the US presidential elections. Why is this money returning now? Is it due to the positive fiscal response, or are there any other factors, perhaps due to the new US president? Why is that happening?
Well, I wouldn't ascribe too much to the Biden victory, although there is a concurrent surge in flows, as you noted. I think some of it is truly related to the fact that most emerging markets have seen a big improvement in their COVID-19 numbers. They have, been able to demonstrate they've been able to bring the crisis under control, albeit at some very high levels in some cases. So the direction or second derivative of numbers is moving in the right way. Secondly, because of the incredible monetary stimulus that's been provided in developed markets, real rates of return remain favorable in many emerging markets. And in the search for yield, money is flowing to countries that have shown that they have strong institutions, strong policy frameworks, and are likely to continue to exhibit those strengths as we move out of the crisis period into next year. Secondly, I would say that there are some U.S. presidential election effects at work. I think we should be cautious in our optimism about a Biden presidency, in that the room to move is going to be constrained by the fact that Congress remains divided between what is likely to be a very narrow majority for the Republicans in the Senate and a Democratic-controlled House of Representatives. That will not provide President Biden with a huge amount of room to maneuver. But I do think it is meaningful that his years in the Senate and his years as vice president do equip him to be a consensus builder. He is someone known for not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. He truly has been someone who has shown a tendency toward constructive compromise over his career, and I fully expect that to be an animating theme of his presidency. So if anyone in this polarized environment has a history of being able to get things done, to reach across the aisle, and perhaps move the stimulus figure up from the $500 billion that the Republican Senate has said it's willing to endorse to something a bit larger, perhaps not the $2 or $3 trillion that the House Democrats have been looking for, or do it in a series of steps, I think it would be a Biden presidency. That said, the Democrats are as conflicted, or in fact more so in some ways, on issues like free trade with the rest of the world. And so I don't expect this administration to issue a full-throated call for more liberalized commercial arrangements with the rest of the world. And I don't expect it to focus substantially on Latin America. I don't see, a Biden presidency making efforts early on to join the CPTPP, to make an effort, as Canada and Australia have done, to become associate members of the Pacific Alliance. In fact, I would expect Latin America will benefit principally from less attention from the White House. And I think that's especially the case for Mexico, where the Trump presidency treated Mexico as a bit of a punching bag and bogeyman for its domestic political audience. I would expect that to end. I would expect this presidency and White House to honor its agreements rather than reopening them again and again. So again, this is a gain particularly for Mexico, which is part of the new NAFTA, the U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And we should see an end to capricious and arbitrary tariffs either being threatened or put into place on things like steel and aluminum, particularly in Mexico's case, contingent on what it does on immigration policy. That kind of randomness will end. We should also see greater respect for international organizations and multinational and multilateral norms. And so I think greater stability and a possibility of expecting and projecting where U.S. policy will go in a fashion that allows investment, particularly investment to feed the North American market in Latin America, will be possible with greater assuredness that the playing field will not change in an arbitrary way midway through that investment being put into place. I don't see a Biden administration initiating other new trade or security agreements in the region. As I mentioned, I don't see it joining CPTPP or Pacific Alliance. But by the same token, I don't see it imposing any other new restrictions. And so all of that is essentially a win for middle-sized economies like those in the Pacific Alliance and Canada, for that matter. And so in that way, our interests here in Toronto are really similar to those interests as commodity exporters, as middle-sized economies, as economies that benefit from an open multilateral system such as those in the Pacific Alliance countries.
Perfect. Thanks, Brett. I think this offers a nice segue into a question we just got from the audience relating to multilateralism and trade and investment, especially foreign direct investment. So Patricio Villegas asks, what do you think about China's continued and growing investment into Latin American markets, especially Chile? I think that also has to do with there was recently an investment made into a huge investment by the China state grid into Chile's energy industry. How do you see that as a trend that's going to keep growing over the next few years, and more Chinese investment in the region?
Well, I'll start by discussing trade first and then moving on to the investment point. I do think a Biden presidency is going to herald more constructive relations with China. I don't think that is going to mean a rollback of some of the pressure on China to participate in the international economy in a more rules-based way. In fact, what I do think it will herald is a more effective engagement with China. It will mean that large industrialized countries will be brought on board with the United States in a more unified discussion around subsidies, around state-owned enterprises, and around the protection of intellectual property. And I think what that will mean is, rather than what are really, kind of false promises by the Chinese to buy more U.S. imports, which, haven't proceeded as the Trump administration demanded at all, and really diverted attention from the much more substantial issues around state-owned enterprises, IP, intellectual property, and trade restrictions. We're going to see a much more effective engagement that leads, I think, to something closer to a bit of a trade and international finance peace with China in the next few years. What that will mean is a more constructive environment for investment from China in Latin America. And I think that should be welcomed, so long as it is in the context of a fair legal system and a rules-based investment environment that treats investors equally with domestic investors and on a consistent basis, regardless of where they come from. All the countries in Latin America, like Canada for that matter, are capital scarce countries where we need international investment in order to develop our natural resources, continue the development of our populations, and integrate in the global economy more effectively. So financing our balance of payments in the region is something for which Chinese investment can be incredibly effective, and certainly to the extent to which it's delivered as foreign direct investment, it provides a more stable source of financing than some of the portfolio flows into equity and fixed income markets, that we saw pull back strongly this year and then come back in. And that kind of back and forth can be difficult for government and business to manage around. And foreign direct investment, provides a little more stable channel to finance the capital goods imports that all of our countries need in order to continue growing effectively.
Perfect. Javiera Palacios asks about, Javiera works at BTG Pactual in Peru, and she asks, speaking again on the theme of foreign direct investment, how is the Pacific Alliance seen by outside investors? So I suppose is it seen as a block? Sometimes in the region we kind of forget that it exists, I will be honest, but do people looking to invest view it as a conjoined region that there's stability, opportunity there?
Well, I would agree with you. I think the profile internationally of the gathering and collection of interest that is the Pacific Alliance is underappreciated and underknown. So I do think that there's an awareness raising process that would be really beneficial for the region. The great thing is that there's just a huge amount of upside and potential on that front. Here in Canada, when we talk about Scotiabank being the Bank of the Pacific Alliance, that almost always does require some explanation of what we mean by the Pacific Alliance. But once it's explained, it does align with savvy and aware investors and individuals' understanding of the Latin American region. They do see the countries on the west side of Latin America gathered under the Pacific Alliance as a distinct and contrasting group to those on the eastern side of South America, who, have joined in a similar trade union, but one that is a customs union that, insists on tariffs being harmonized and is as much about keeping out international goods and trade as letting them in. In contrast, the Pacific Alliance sets a really different model. It's much more in the spirit of open regionalism that is devoted to providing a platform for concerted reduction in external tariffs, opening up to best practices, and channeling capital into the region. And that's why Canada, Australia, Singapore, and New Zealand have expressed an interest in becoming associate members. It's a really great model of what middle-sized economies in the world can do to increase their impact, increase their profile, and move in a concerted fashion to do things that alone are difficult things to do, often with regard to domestic political interests and in terms of countries' engagement with the world. So I do think there is a lot of upside potential to greater awareness of the alliance, and I think it actually does provide an incredibly effective platform for making the region even more attractive to foreign investment.
Definitely some work there for them to be done. So changing tack a little bit, we've got a question from Elizabeth Martins, and she's asking about aviation. Can you talk a little bit on how you see the situation of Avianca, Aeromexico, and Copa, for instance? I'd add into that Latam, which underwent Chapter 11 in the US. We actually hosted an aviation panel yesterday with Latam Cargo, Avianca, and JetSmart, which is low cost. They were all very positive about local markets, not so much about regional markets. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't analyze individual companies as a macroeconomist, but what I will speak to is how I see international tourism and trade flows developing over the next few years. On the tourism front, as we noted, looking at the domestic sectors in Latin America and the Pacific Alliance more specifically, we are likely to see continued challenges on the tourism, hospitality, and cultural affairs front in every country in the world, not just in Latin America, until widespread adoption and distribution of vaccines is a feature of global society. I think confidence in travel is going to remain impaired for some time until that takes place. But once those are in place, I do think we're going to see a reversion back to something closer to the way life looked prior to the pandemic than some commentators have suggested. And this is more of a sociological point than a purely economistic point. I think, the op-ed pieces that have taken the view that everything is different now and nothing will go back to normal after the crisis ignores what are some very deep human and cultural tendencies toward discovery of the new, toward travel, toward adventure, toward being together. We talk a lot about being together but apart during the pandemic. One of the most important things as vaccines are distributed is that people will want to be together, truly both virtually and physically. And it's one of the reasons I think doomy obituaries for cities are far overdone too. Generally, people have tended to move into urban areas to an increasing extent over the last 100 years or so. I don't see that being reversed. I see cities and travel being made more resilient to what will be future pandemics. If we look at the last 20 years, about every 5 years, we've had something like the novel coronavirus pop up, whether it's MERS, the COVID-1 or novel coronavirus 1, SARS, H1N1. This is likely to be a regular feature of the years going forward. Maybe they aren't as contagious or as lethal as the current virus that we're dealing with, but I think we're going to see cities, travel, and other sectors rebuild in a way that will be more resilient to future pandemics, and policy measures will be put into place to ensure that we're able to respond more quickly as well. So I'm very hopeful for sectors like tourism, transportation, culture, and hospitality, but really at the point where vaccines become well distributed. Before then, I think substantial support from governments and from the financial sector is going to continue to be necessary for these sectors so that we don't lose the capacity that we've built when we get to that point where travel is easier again. But until then, I think it's good to be clear-minded that we have some real challenges ahead. On the trade and the cargo front that you spoke to, we have seen trade numbers which took a dip earlier this year start rebounding again. And it's worth remembering that international trade was at its highest historical levels coming into the pandemic. So while we've pulled back a bit, we are still at, by historical perspective, very, very high trade flows. And it won't take much to get those back up to record levels again. Trade is going to be different, almost certainly, in terms of some more focus on local sourcing of some goods. But I think those who say, the era of globalization is over are patently wrong. And I'm not saying that just because I'm some kind of internationalist optimist. We can see, for instance, from the Trump trade wars that preceded the outbreak of the epidemic, those sectors that had internationally diversified supply chains, with production and distribution in a number of different places, were able to pivot immediately to the Trump tariffs, keep their supply and production operations alive, and experience the lowest disruption. So the notion that bringing everything back home and doing everything locally is the most robust response to the crisis is patently false. We know both from finance and from other aspects of life that diversification is one of the most effective ways of guarding ourselves against problems in the future. And I fully expect globalization, both in terms of goods flows, capital flows, and flows in people, to go back to record levels in the coming years.
Yeah, you're definitely echoing the sentiments that came in from the CEO of Latam Cargo. He was very bullish about the prospects regarding cargo and freight over the next while. And we're coming into the last 5 minutes. And we've got a couple of sort of quick fire questions that we can go through regarding a couple of issues. First one comes from, I think, a colleague of yours, Claire Horan. She's asking about your thoughts on Janet Yellen taking the Treasury role in the new US government, and what do you think that means for US dollar exchange rates going forward? Obviously, a huge issue for many Latin American markets.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that Janet Yellen is going to be the most qualified and experienced person to ever take the Treasury chair in the United States. Her roles in government have been unprecedented compared with any other Treasury secretary, and they're accompanied by a sterling academic and research background. I don't think there is anyone who could be more qualified and at the same time better known as a consensus builder to take over the U.S. Treasury at this time going forward. So kudos to her and our thanks, because as the Biden administration takes office to lead out of this difficult situation, I am truly grateful to know that we'll have someone so competent in that seat. In terms of implications for the U.S. dollar, of course, it's a bit of a truism that during times of crises, we tend to see flows into U.S. assets, and those tend to boost the value of the U.S. dollar. I think there's more or less a strong consensus view that the U.S. dollar is likely to come down in value over time as the pandemic is brought under control. I think the real question is to what extent that's likely to be the case. I think the most bearish outlooks for the U.S. dollar are overdone, and it certainly is unbelievable to think the U.S. dollar won't decline somewhat in value, but I would not be banking on a fire sale on the U.S. dollar in the years ahead, particularly because getting out of the crisis is likely to take some time. And in almost every economy, we would anticipate that we will not see economic growth back to levels that we saw at the beginning of this year until about the end of 2021 or early 2022. So that'll provide still a bit of a support for the US dollar and keep exports from emerging market countries like those in Latin America fairly competitive, and also keep the prices that are paid for natural commodities relatively high.
Diego Borjas asks, what are the risks for the banking sector in 2021 and 2022 after all of these large credit issuances? Are they overexposed?
Well, we do think that rates are likely to steepen at the longer end of curves going into 2021 and into 2022 as markets start pricing further progress on the recovery and control of the public health crisis. So it is an excellent time to lock in long-term funding, but we don't see those rates or yields, I should say, going up particularly much. You know, at the 10-year or 30-year tenors, we're still going to see them well below 2% over the next 2 years. And if they're to creep further than that, I think you're going to see central banks in the US, for instance, acting to try to control those yields at the longer end of the curve. So I don't see particular stress in credit markets coming from a backup in yield curves. The real question, I think, is more so ensuring that households and businesses are able to revive demand, and that's where fiscal policy is going to play a critical role in the next few years, because we don't face a crisis because funding is expensive or unabundant. We continue to face a challenge around demand, and we need to de-risk investment and continue supporting consumer demand, and that's a real role for government everywhere in the next year or two.
Thanks, Brett. I hope, Diego, that answered your question. We're coming to the end of our time here. We've got to move on shortly to our next panel with the Grupos Multilatinos. Before we go, I just wanted to ask yourself, Brett, and perhaps Robert too, just if you have any last messages or predictions, prospects for our audience, and perhaps for the multilatina companies as well, as what they should be on the lookout for and how they should prepare for their reactivation next year.
Well, I think there's a real window of opportunity right now. If you are exposed to sectors that are already reopening or are likely to benefit in the next year or two from widespread distribution of the vaccine, the cheap funding markets that you see right now are a real opportunity to invest and build the capacity to respond to what should be a decent recovery in demand and real growth going through 2021.
Yeah, I would add, Brett, that I think in general we're fairly optimistic of where Latam and also the PAC countries are headed in the future. We're seeing a lot of activity between multilatinas, more and more every year. That is, Latin American countries doing cross-border investments into other Latin American countries. And we see that with a lot of optimism. We see certain sectors consolidating, which also opens up opportunities for strengthening and making industries a little bit more robust and certain sectors more robust. So, we remain optimistic. Obviously, we have to sort of navigate these volatile waters. But at the end, I do see light at the end of the tunnel, and so we stay optimistic to the region and continue to invest.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Robert. Y muchas gracias a la audiencia. Ahora vamos a pasar al siguiente panel. Grupos multilatinos son la clave para la reactivación económica. Una conversación con el Grupo Energía de Bogotá y el Grupo AGE. Nos vemos en 5 minutos en la próxima charla. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.